For almost half a century, the entire world lived under the shadow of a conflict that was, well, it was unlike any other. This wasn't a war with direct battles between the major powers, but a massive global struggle over ideas, influence, and just raw intimidation. And that standoff, it literally shaped the world we're all living in today. So let's break down how it all went down. I mean, just look at this. Can you imagine living with this hanging over your head every single day? This cartoon from 1962, it might seem dramatic, but it was the terrifying reality of the time. You've got the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, locked in this intense test of strength, and the price of losing was the annihilation of everything. The entire planet was at stake. So, how on earth did we get to that point? Well, after World War II ended, everyone was hoping for peace. But instead, that grand alliance that defeated fascism, it completely fell apart. The world didn't come together, it fractured, splitting right down the middle into two hostile, opposing camps. And it was Winston Churchill, in 1946, who gave this new reality a name, with these famous words, the Iron Curtain. It wasn't just a clever phrase, it was a hard physical barrier. Think about what that actually means. We're talking families torn apart, travel forbidden, information totally controlled. It was a very real division separating the democratic West from the communist, Soviet-controlled East. Okay, so this slide really lays out the two sides of that curtain. On one side, you have the United States and its allies all rallying around capitalism and democracy, formalized in the NATO military alliance. Their whole goal? Contain communism. And on the other side, you've got the Soviet Union and its satellite states, all tied together by the Warsaw Pact and driven by the goal of spreading communism around the globe. Yeah, it was a total zero-sum game. If one side gained anything, the other saw it as a massive loss. So what was the American game plan to win this thing? Well, it all came down to one single word: containment. And look, this wasn't about trying to destroy communism where it already was. Nope, it was about drawing a line in the sand and using all of America's military and economic might to make sure it didn't spread 1 inch further. This one idea would guide U.S. foreign policy for decades. And we didn't have to wait long for the first major test of this whole containment idea. It happened right here, in the divided city of Berlin. The Soviets tried to starve West Berlin into submission by blockading it. But the US and its allies didn't respond with tanks, they responded with planes. For almost a whole year, they flew in everything, food, fuel, you name it, keeping the city alive and sending a crystal clear message that the West was not going to back down. But here's the thing, a direct, all-out war between two nuclear-armed superpowers? That was completely unthinkable. So, the Cold War found other ways to get hot. The US and the USSR fought each other indirectly, basically using other countries as their battlegrounds. So what exactly is a proxy war? Well, as you can see here, instead of, American GIs fighting Soviet soldiers on a battlefield, which would be World War III, the superpowers would basically pick a side in someone else's war. They'd send weapons, money, and advisors to opposing factions. So places like Korea and Vietnam, they became these absolutely devastating battlegrounds for a war between Washington and Moscow. And the Korean War, man, that was one of the first and most brutal examples of this. After Korea was divided, the Soviet-backed North invaded the US-backed South. What followed was 3 years of horrific fighting that killed millions of people and ended right back where it started, in a stalemate. And it cemented that heavily fortified border, a division we literally still live with to this day. And that leads right into the next, and maybe even more divisive, proxy war. The goal was pretty much the same: containment. But the reason they gave for it? Well, that had a whole new name. And this was the domino theory. The idea was, like a line of dominoes. If one country in a region tipped over into communism, the fear was that its neighbors would inevitably fall, one by one. And this one theory, this one idea was powerful enough to drag the United States into one of the longest and most controversial wars in its entire history. But for all the fighting and proxy wars, the single most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, it lasted just 13 days. In October of 1962, the entire world just held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The discovery of Soviet nukes in Cuba brought the US and the USSR right to the edge of all-out nuclear war. So the question is, what stopped them? What pulled the world back from the edge? Well, it was this really grim but effective logic: mutually assured destruction, or perfectly mad. Both sides knew that if they launched their missiles, the other side would launch theirs, and the result would be the complete end of both countries and probably the world. It's this terrifying kind of balance, and honestly, it goes right back to that arm wrestling cartoon we looked at in the beginning. But this fight for supremacy, it wasn't just about soldiers and tanks. No, it was a battle for hearts and minds, a competition to prove which system, capitalism or communism, was truly the best. And it was fought everywhere, in science labs, at the Olympics, even in movie theaters. Because the war wasn't just fought with soldiers on the ground, right? The question became, who would conquer the heavens? The space race was the ultimate technological showdown, a way to prove whose ideology was superior on a cosmic scale. And at first, the Soviets dealt a huge blow to American pride. They launched Sputnik in '57. That little satellite sent shockwaves across the US. But America responded in a big way, creating NASA and pouring billions of dollars into catching up. And it all culminated, of course, with that giant leap for mankind in 1969, the moon landing. That was a massive, massive propaganda win for the West. Meanwhile, back here on Earth, a totally different kind of race was happening, the race for information. You have to remember, this was the first time in history that a war was broadcast right into people's living rooms, night after night. Seeing the brutal reality of the Vietnam War on TV fueled so much skepticism and turned public opinion against the conflict in a way the government just couldn't control. And it's really important to understand that for a lot of people, this wasn't just about politics or economics. In some of the source materials we looked at, the conflict is framed in these really stark, moral, almost spiritual terms, a literal struggle of light versus darkness. This worldview shaped how policies like containment and wars like Vietnam were seen by millions, and it added this incredible layer of intensity to what was at stake. All right, so as we move into the 70s and 80s, the Cold War is entering its final chapter. Decades of this intense competition and massive military spending were really starting to wear things down, especially inside the Soviet Union. And you can really see the American strategy shift during this time. In the 70s, you had President Nixon's policy of détente, which was all about easing tensions through diplomacy. But then in the 80s, President Reagan came in and took a much tougher stance. He used strong rhetoric and pushed for this incredibly ambitious, some said impossible, missile defense system called SDI, but everyone called it Star Wars. The idea of a space shield put huge economic pressure on the Soviets to even try and keep up. And that brings us to this iconic moment. Reagan, standing at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in 1987, throwing down a direct, public challenge to the Soviet leader. It was a powerful symbol of the West's determination to finally see the Iron Curtain come crashing down. But, maybe the biggest push for change actually came from inside the Soviet Union. The new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, brought in these two revolutionary reforms: glasnost, which meant more openness and free speech, and perestroika, which was an attempt to restructure the failing economy. The irony is, his goal was to save the Soviet system, but by loosening that iron grip just a little bit, he accidentally unleashed forces that nobody could control. And after that, things happened so fast, it was almost dizzying. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. People were literally climbing on top of it, dancing, chipping away at this concrete symbol that had divided a city for a generation. It was incredible. And then, just 2 years later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself just dissolved. The 45-year standoff was over. So the Soviet Union collapses. And it really felt like a definitive end, right? Like communism was being buried for good. But it leaves us with this final, really important question. The map of the world was redrawn, for sure. But the alliances, the nuclear arsenals, the regional conflicts that were started during that time, a lot of them are still with us. The Cold War might be over, but have its echoes, have they really gone away?